Hi everybody, and welcome back to today's midweek episode of the Renaissance Builder. Now I figure last time we talked about voltage and the very basics of electricity. I figured today we can fill that in with the other two factors of Ohm's Law. So, I'm Alex, and you're watching the Renaissance Builder. Now, Ohm's Law, what I'm referring to is one of the most basic and core equations in the electrical world. So E over I times R, that's Ohm's Law. It states that it takes 1 volt to push 1 amp through 1 ohm. Now, let's break that down into something simple. What that means is we need 1 volt, and think of volts as like a pressure. It's actually pretty easy to relate this to water coming out of your garden hose, right? So, think of the volts like the water pressure. Think of the amps like the water flow. So, if you're familiar enough with water, you need a certain amount of pressure to push a certain amount of flow. So the amps are the flow. And then the ohms, that's the resistance. That's your thumb over the end of the garden hose. That's the kink in the garden hose, right? It's a resistance. There's one term that, well, you really don't have to know. It's kind of superfluous, but a Coulomb. It's the measurement of how many actual electrons there are in an amp. Remember, the amps are the flow. So if there's flow, there's going to be an amount of, right? The pressure is just how much force we're putting on it. But the flow needs to be an amount of something. So a Coulomb is how we actually measure, is the actual measurement of the electrons. Now, 1 Coulomb, get this, and this number goes over my head. It really does. 6.25 billion electrons. Yeah, the writing's scribblish, but whatever. Per second. It's a second. An amp is a matter of flow, not just... So a Coulomb is a matter of how much, but an amp is an actual, term of flow. So we have to determine the time differential in there, the time it takes to flow per second. So 1 amp per second. That means that, let's say I have 1 amp in this wire. That means there are 6.25 billion electrons flowing every second. It's crazy when you think about it. It's real crazy. I mean, this is the kind of stuff you can only see with, crazy big microscopes seeing tiny things. So anyhow, that's amperage. It's the flow of electrons. Now, a resistance. Not to get too vague about it, but the resistance here is basically anything that impedes the flow of electrons. So, let's say you have, if you have an electric resistance heater, a hair dryer. That's a perfect example. So a hair dryer, the way a circuit works in a hair dryer is we apply voltage to one end, and then we have these little heating coils in there, right? You ever look down the snoot of a hair dryer, you see these little heating coils. Well, those heating coils are a very set resistance. And when we apply a voltage to that, right? So we apply our volts to that resistance. And let's just say, it's 100 ohms of resistance. I don't know what it actually is. I haven't measured a hair dryer, but let's just say for shits and giggles that it's 100 ohms. So that's a resistance. It takes force. It creates a restriction to the flow. So what we're going to do, in this case to make that work, and what we're going to do is we're going to take our voltage and push as many amps through that resistance as we can, and that causes it to heat up. So that's one source of resistance. Another source of resistance, which we can get into in another video, is actually called induction. So an induction motor, it works with magnetic fields and its relative, the magnetic field's relative position in reference to a conductor. So how all that combination works can generate another kind of resistance. So anyhow, that's amperage and that's resistance. So now you know about voltage and, you know, alternating current versus DC current and how it's all DC current. So now we know amperage is the flow and resistance is literally the resistance to flow. So pressure, flow, resistance all works together. That's basic electricity, like very basic electricity, but you get it. So that went a little more long-winded than I thought, than I was originally intending. So thank you for sticking through that and watching the whole thing. But hopefully you learned something, and hopefully you liked it. So when you like it, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button. Now, go ahead and subscribe because, as you can see over here, we've got some very interesting things we're doing with this electrical stuff. So go ahead, make sure you're subscribed, and hit that bell icon so you're notified when these videos come out. So, till next time, guys, you take care.
Bye-bye.